Hello, hello. Welcome back to People Purpose Place for our lunchtime chat on Mondays. Can you hear me okay, Rowan?
Yeah, I got you loud and clear. Sorry, I hadn't. It sounds like we might have just been unmuted now, but yeah, welcome back to lunchtime with People Purpose Place.
Yeah, awesome. And we again, unfortunately, don't have Christine with us this week, but that's fine. We appreciate one of the, which might even be part of my check-in question today when we get there. Part of what we're doing is trying to understand the humanity of all of these experiences, right? And we need to be, realistic and empathetic about our personal journey, and don't try and prioritize everything over. Getting something like a podcast out on a Monday is not more important than Christine being in her best well-being. So I'm sure we'll have her back in the next week or so that'll be good. And because we only have the two amigos, we thought it might be good to spend a bit of time on the boring stuff that Christine wouldn't be interested in anyway, which, getting down to tax on place.
Yes.
And we on purpose stay away from this conversation as much as you and I have been in this space for all of our lives and are passionate about getting better solutions. We always fully are aware that, the name is People Purpose Place for a reason. And that's because no one's talking about the people or the purpose. Everyone's talking about the place, talking about the housing crisis, this massive housing crisis, which is really just ignoring what's happening in the background, which is, what's happening with the people and how that works. And that's why, but we know everyone's drawn to the place conversation, right? Everyone wants to talk about how many bathrooms they got, or, I don't like this from where this is located
in the bench tops.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned last week that we had to be careful having this conversation about place because people can become distracted by, I don't like that in this location. And I think even when Gin Road gets delivered, I was actually had a thought in the last short period of time about some of the unique things about Gin Road that I think are going to challenge people front and square and center in regards to thinking differently about design.
And I think the greatest difficulty with this conversation about the place, the physical things, is that becomes where we get bogged down in. And far too often people want to have a debate about, is it two bathrooms or 2.5 with one powder room downstairs, which is minutiae detail in the grand scheme of things. The outcome that we're focused on is places where humans can thrive rather than being, debating the merits of, rectified edge tiles or stone bench tops or whatever, which is really minor details.
Absolutely. And we might even today, and it was a good suggestion by you earlier on, that as we go through this, we'll also show you where these links are on our website, and we'll go through that process so you guys can jump on and see that. Now, the idea of having the place section on our website is primarily because there is not a solution without first considering the person at the front. So all of these solutions could be extremely bad for some people and extremely good for others. Correct. And that's why we like to highlight, and this discussion will be primarily around the pros and cons of each one of these solutions. And then we use this term a lot, that this is a solution, not the solution. And there'll be some people this works for, and some of it will be the economics of finance. Some of it will be the functionality of the humans. Some of it will be, it's already one of these things in this location. So there's all of these things that we can discuss today. But following on with our normal process, and I actually have added a couple of extra things back in here for us to discuss, but we're having our check-in. And I went back to the old tried and true one, which is what I have to put aside to be present today. Ron, what do you think?
Yeah, for me, I have another technology update. So I've a source of frustration with technological locked in and locked out, and so I have a expert coming along to coach me through to my next level of understanding, and that's been really I have to adjust my own framing, that I have to admit that I use technology and I need to be literate with it, and I need to just put in the effort to get the skill, to develop the skill, which is at 54, it's taken me a long time to get to that point to go, yes, I actually have to do that. Because there's all these benefits for my work and business and doing better podcasts. So I have to put that aside.
And it is intriguing how we have these internal triggers. And, I had a similar one this week in regards to, working through difficult things, which I quite often say to clients. I feel comfortable with being uncomfortable, but that's till you have to do it yourself, right?
That's for other people.
Yeah. So ultimately, I've had a couple of those experiences. But for me to be present today, I've had just a couple of interactions over the last 3 or 4 days, which I've had some really high hopes that I've seen some, and we don't like to use that word too often, but that we see humanity coming out in a lot of conversations, and they leave me feeling warmed and give me some real excitement that what we're proposing with People Purpose Place is important and worthwhile. And then every so often you have those explosive moments where everyone leaves the person behind and is just talking about, can I get something? And I want something, and I'm very important and you're not very important, and all of these things happen. And I think maybe
that we lose.
Exactly. And I think it gets away, back to this technological attunement. You need to be waiting for me while, when you're ready, I need something from you. In difference to just accepting every moment for itself. And I think, in the last particularly 3 or 4 days, I've struggled with some of those things. So I'm extremely happy to be able to put those aside, to be able to talk some turkey about places. And something we maybe haven't done much of is an intent and a desired outcome, which I know we talk about a bit, but I was thinking about modeling that a little bit today. So the intent of today is to discuss, housing options with the lens of people first. So this is a conversation about, here's some alternatives. What are the people that this is trying to suit and maybe not suit? And then from a desired outcome, if people were more resourced from listening to this conversation about what their housing needs could possibly be, that would be a massive win. So you and I know, and we talked about it last week, so few people actually go on the journey of actually figuring what they need from their house before they go through the design process. It's almost minuscule because there's so many other factors which are in play there, and quite often the human's not one of them.
And it doesn't mean to say that we have to ignore finance. So in our thinking, we accept that we have to operate in the real world. So we're not, waiting on a winning of lotto or some benefactor turning up with money that they no longer need. Their bank account's too full, so they just want to hand it to you. That's not the thinking. We understand that's part of it, but our lens for today is thinking from a human approach, assuming that our financial part has been met, because that's important to us to still be compliant with building code and financially achievable.
Yeah, and that's right. And, still be compliant. We don't want to, while we certainly want to find the grey areas in planning and building to make sure that we're maximising it for the humans involved. The truth is it does need to fit inside a normal framework. We're not proposing you go and build a teepee in someone else's backyard and start living there. That's not the solutions we're proposing. Whereas I think it sounds like a great idea, but it's not something that, can be compliant or reasonable to some extent. So, and I think we might put aside, I really liked Christine's idea about maybe before we had these conversations about housing, actually diving into this idea of having a minor, and, I still wonder whether we should be using this word meditation, but having a section of visioning to imagine yourself in the situation of someone who is actually in elevated housing crisis. So whether that be actually homeless or one of those other things, that so that then when we look at all of these housing solutions, you'd have a very different lens on, right? Like if you'd probably take any of them, which is probably not the best way to be at, but realistically it changes your perspective. But we might even leave that till when Christine's around, because I'd love to hear her experiences from doing that. So jumping into the actual built form, I might see whether Colby can bring up our webpage, and that will ultimately then allow people to say, hey, if we also want to find this, this is where we can wander around to see it. So you'll see People Purpose Place at the top of our website, and today we're talking about place. So the idea is, what we would do is, here's some case studies, and we'll start off with the 11th Avenue example. And yep, there it is there. And the idea is we can just talk to this as a solution, add in some components, and then certainly talk about the pros and cons and who it might suit or not suit. So
everyone's champing right now for the lines on a page and the image, and I get that, but we have started that this is a intention, and making that clear at the outset, because it won't be for everybody. Absolutely.
So maybe you want to scroll down a little bit there, Colby, and we'll just actually have a look at the images, because it's going to be easier for people to get their head around what we're actually looking at. So if you just click on the main image in the middle so you can just see this. So this is actually a completed product, and it is in Railway Estate, which is a suburb in Townsville. But the premise behind this is a lot of older areas of most cities, towns, cities, regional areas are all built quite often on a cottage format, so the miner's cottage or the town cottage format, which was generally around about 10 meters wide, which is different in feet and inches, of course, when it was originally done, but sort of 10 by 40. And the normal allotment we're seeing quite often most of our cities is this 20 by 40, which surprisingly enough in a lot of areas is actually just two miners' cottage blocks put together. Now, I put that down to, this is just purely an observation, it may not be the truth. I put that down to the changing wealth within Australia. So around the Great Depression, everyone was seeking just accommodation, right? So no one had any money in the 1930s, coming back from, coming out of one war and feeling like we were coming into another war. Everyone was just looking for what they needed to survive. It wasn't a want. So there was a lot of these cottage blocks developed. Now in Townsville, I noticed what happened is these blocks were developed, but they actually weren't built on until the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s sort of configuration. So what actually happened is, because they're actually relatively affordable once you got beyond those pure fear driven purchasing, they put them over two allotments, which quite often means that there is actually a lot of allotments in a lot of cities, towns and cities, regional areas that are actually two blocks together. Yeah. And this is the solution for one. So this is using standard building practice, which is working on the idea of, can we have a house which is in two components? So you'll see essentially the carport at the front, or the garage at the front. The original design works on this context, and we can probably go to the floor plan, which might be one of the ones scrolling to the right or scrolling to the left there, Colby. But the floor plan basically has a lower floor plan and upper floor plan, because obviously you can see the studio apartment which sits up on top. So this is the lower floor plan, which clearly shows essentially this is a 3-bedroom home, which has its entrance on the northern side. You'll see the little porch up the top there. And then it's a normal 3-bedroom home facing the rear of the allotment, which gives that person in that little apartment or little dwelling plenty of privacy. It also is, from a solar orientation, quite good, because with north sort of pointing up this, it means that you're going to have some northern aspect on that side of the building as far as breeze and those sorts of things. Then you'll notice a little set of stairs which go up to the garage. Now, they're designed to be on the opposite side to the entrance for the actual smaller dwelling in the backyard there. So if you just scroll forward to the apartment or the studio apartment, which sits up on top of the actual...
I don't think we'll have the second... I don't think we have the upstairs plan there.
I think I did see it. Oh, okay. Yep, cool. But if it is there, basically what happens is there's a little of apartment over the top. So of the garage. So the idea of this was, although it is designed as a dwelling, and essentially it could either be a house and a granny flat in a new build, or it could theoretically just be a full complete build. The idea of it was to allow multiple groups to actually be able to operate on what is a relatively small parcel. So this is essentially, if it is 10 meters by 40 meters, a 400 square meter allotment. Now, one of the things which we will touch on in the end is we're also talking about, making sure that we comply with regulations.
Yeah.
So this house is actually on a block which has its set-outs covered by, in Queensland, a concept called the QDC, which is the Queensland Development Code, which says if you're not on a development, you should apply, or you should keep these standard rules. And this house complies with those standard rules. So it's set back from the boundary. It's not on the boundary as such, which has some pros and cons, but it is ultimately the good use of what is a small site.
Yeah, and it's and maybe that's even the adapting through your life. So when you have young kids and you want them near to you, you want to have maybe the master bedroom and nursery and a bedroom adjacent to the main bedroom. But when you have the smelly 18 to 20-year-old teenagers who are just finding their own feet and want to have large parties, and they're studying and keeping odd hours, finally getting them into a completely different postcode, up over top of the garage might be a really good place to have them. So you've got that sound and some separation of privacy.
Absolutely. And as far as some of the pros and cons, and we probably have some there written there, but you do have true freehold title. So although as it stands, you can't sell each part individually, you certainly have freehold title. So that's a benefit. By building on top of the garage, you also have off-site storage for a garage. So one of the concerns or weaknesses potentially of a unit is the fact that you're sometimes struggling for car storage. Obviously, if rented out, essentially they're higher yield because each one of those individual bedrooms would be of a high value because you have privacy, access, and functionality. So from that point of view, that's handy. Also, by the block being small, relatively, the price of the block of land is actually balanced with the fact that you're able to put a lot of house on relatively what is a small block of land. And the cons, I think, are really that because we are using the QDC, we have to use standard setbacks, right? So in a build-to-boundary development, like some of the new greenfield ones that might be produced by, Stocklands or Delphin or any of those other major player developers, you can normally build to the boundary, which does allow you more freedom of, access to yard and that sort of stuff. So it is quite difficult to get this design to work. It also does show that this is still two fairly isolated pods, right? This is not a community connection. You would be cohabitants.
That's not in each other's grill. You could come and go shift work or university hours or whatever without necessarily interfering with the other household at all.
Correct. Now, if you were actually a household, like as in you're a fully formed household, which is one of the things we aspire that every group considers getting to, whether that actually be a family household or a familiar household, then you would be looking for higher levels of connectivity, and that might be to be able to get to the backyard where you have some shared space or whatever. So that's one of those things that could be considered. Obviously, in a lot of these areas, there's parks close, so even though you're on a small allotment, it's not really restricting you too much. And the only other ... there is one of the things which we've realized a lot over the years is 2-story is really good, but some people really don't like it, so these ideas of at some point, got old knees like me, living upstairs there is probably not ideal. We've also found things like if you have to, carry groceries upstairs, for instance, that can be quite a laborious thing if you're having to carry a load upstairs and all of those sorts of things.
And I guess some of that is it stands out in the community as well, Darren. If you've got everyone else is low set in the street, and you have one high set at the front of the property, so it's not set back particularly, but it's right at the front. It can be a bit stark. That said, it does deliver all the benefits that we've spoken about as well. So it's just saying that here's another solution, not the only solution or the perfect solution, but there are definitely different ways of doing housing.
Absolutely. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So we can probably now move on to another style, and probably to have a real contrast, it might actually be good to, if you click on case studies, Colby, we might even go and have a look at, the normal conventional 4 by 2 by 2. So, and we put this in here because ultimately this is the stock which is currently entering the market at reasonably high volumes, isn't it, Ryan? Very
much so. I've actually got some interesting stats there out of the Australian Bureau of Stats last census. So 2021, it's quite current.
Yeah.
And the number of 3 and 4 bedroom homes is just above the top of the page there, showing at about 6.8 million of our homes, with nearly 11 million homes, and well more than half at 6.8 are 3 and 4 bedroom format.
Wow.
Much like this.
Yeah, right. And then when you have a look at the actual population that goes in that, I think we said there was, if that's 3/4 of the stock, it turns out less than half of the people going in there. Well, they got couples with children are 2.9 million.
Yeah.
So that, that's like 10% or 12% of the population. And yet almost 70% of the stock is built for this group of people. So why is it? Why does that happen?
I think it's down to the intent that largely we're just building with a financial intent.
Right.
So we're not actually considering a human response. I suspect that most building designs and building businesses aren't informed by these sort of demographic considerations.
Mm-hmm.
And they're only considering, how do I build one that is going to sell, is going to get value by the bank's mechanism, and I can make a profit on? So that's just a purely financial lens, which then necessarily points back to, well, just do the same as we've always done.
Yeah. And as you said, some of it might purely be that it's easy for a bank to have use this as a comparison. So then you can easily lend for this thing. And certainly if someone else has got it, it's easy for marketeers to also say, hey, this is what you should aspire to. And then obviously we've all done it, right? Got into the roller coaster of going, oh, we need what everyone else has got. Maybe we need a bigger block, or maybe we need a home theatre or whatever.
So the argument is self-fulfilling. 6.8 million of them are these things.
Yeah.
You need to get one of those.
Yeah, right.
Not at all considering, I'm a 2-person household, or in actual fact, I think the number in Queensland, for example, is 1/4 of our households are 1-person households.
Yeah, wow. And I think that's also reflected in a few of the conversations I've had with real estate agents, where they've sort of, they've made this statement that, everyone's looking for this, 1 and 2 and 3 bedroom thing, and there's just no stock there for it. And that's a combination of 2 things, isn't it? One is that's all a lot of people need, but secondly, that's all that they can afford. So if one of these, even in Townsville now, is probably, by the time you put in a block of land, is $500,000 or $600,000, which is unheard of considering our median house price was in the low 300s. Then that's just why people are going, I want this other one because one, it suits me, and secondly, that's all I can afford. But in reality, there's just no stock there to suit them. The other observation is you'll notice this design really is a point in time. So it is really designed absolutely 100% for this idea that, one, there's a person who owns the house because they have priority in regards to functionality. So that's the master bedroom or the bedroom one. It's got the ensuite. It's got the best view. It's in the backyard, all of those sorts of things. And everyone else is subordinate to that process, which maybe works okay when you're looking to be highly connected to children. But as far as, is that suitable for, equals to be living together? Probably not. And even if you had any issues with privacy, the idea that you're all coming out into a hallway without being able to come in and go to and from the property without having to all pass each other is certainly something that's highly noticeable with this design. So extremely unadaptable and designed for a percentage of the market, which, as we see, is just skewed in the wrong direction. So, so it's good to have that contrast to actually, go and have a look at what we're actually building, because that may not actually be consistent with what we need to be building or what's best suited for the people who are going into it. So, so moving on to the next one, I thought it might be handy to talk about granny flats because they're actually it's a big conversation piece at the moment, right? And certainly we have experienced over the years they get called lots of different things, relatives apartments, granny flats, all these different things. And there was some really strange planning rules in regards to them. They had to be a relative at one stage, and they had to be this size or that size or whatever might be the case. But we've seen that ebb and flow over time. And I think maybe Toowoomba might have been one of those first areas that really put it out there as a strong solution, because that's where we started to see a lot of them show up in a short period of time. And that maybe wasn't necessarily the best outcome either when they all started to arrive at once.
Yeah, I think we've found some suburbs and some streets where they had a really high density for whatever reason, whether a collection of investors took up the idea for the higher yield and then had this additional household on every residential block, which choked the street and really didn't deliver a great community outcome.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think I think that's when I've actually heard a few people have this conversation. We need to promote more granny flats. And I think there is absolutely a place for that in the market. But I think we need to be careful that we're aware of how this gets used. So, as you said, if you're a slumlord millionaire sort of investor and you had a pretty crappy house somewhere in a suburb, you could quite easily put in that design we just put there, which is another 2 bedrooms. Maybe the house itself has 3 or 4 bedrooms, maybe even 5 bedrooms. And then ultimately you could rent all of those rooms out individually. And if those individuals weren't, you didn't have some way to form a household with that group, then what would happen is you might end up with 6 or 7 cars on that one allotment. Now, by itself, it would be annoying. 6 in the street?
Doesn't fit.
Doesn't work.
And we're actually seeing in Southeast Queensland, we're seeing plenty of some suburbs worse than others, that you see the whole front yard is just concrete hardstand for cars.
Yeah.
Which looks horrific from the street. They accept that they're not going to be parked under a roof in a garage off street, but you've got this collection of, and maybe it's student or maybe it's first professional income after university. So we're going out in a share house kind of situation. But 5 of them parked on the front yard is not at all uncommon.
And I think one thing we've talked about is there is ways in actual fact this can work. So if you were intentionally forming a household, which might be made up of unrelated parties who decided, okay, well, we want to see the benefit of reducing our personal cost of living and living in a great location in the existing suburb, then maybe
work, etc.
Correct. And as we've talked about, all of these teachers who are teaching at private schools or public schools even that are in the center of our cities, they have to live an hour and a half away because they can't afford to be in any of the postcodes. They're not paid anywhere near enough money to live in any of those postcodes. So this might be an alternative where they can live close to where they work and stop those 3 hours of travel every day, which is massively consuming of your life.
Well, how much tutoring, how much extra value, how much professional development can you do if you halve that or spend a quarter of that, had a 10-minute commute each way and spent 2.5 hours doing school assessment or whatever, rather than burning your weekends and burning your, blowing people up, which is what we're finding in the professions, particularly these low income professions. Healthcare is another one. They can't retain people.
Absolutely. And can they even be considering then sharing some resources? So maybe we don't need all of those cars. We might be able to share electric car, which is the core basis of how we travel around. Use one of those apps so you can book it and regularly be aware of that. Cross-use power. So some people are going to be there during the day. Some people might be there at night. Are there ways to look at what is a standard solution, being a granny flat, into something that could be highly adaptable, which could softly increase density, but also improve societal outcomes. And I think that's the one thing that people are missing, is they're, again, removing the people going, yes, this could actually be a really good solution. So a couple of the pros and cons. Well, obviously it allows for our existing suburbs to be enriched and slightly densified. It does allow for, and I see this as an opportunity. I mean, I've even considered this from our point of view here personally, that if we move to another location, some of those spots, some of those houses might not be suitable for us as we get older. So maybe we need to consider the fact that if we built a granny flat, it could be fully accessible. And then it might be that other, maybe the boys or maybe not the boys could be living in the other components, which might be upstairs and downstairs, which could be fully enclosed, living pods essentially, which would allow for then a better use of accessibility. So it says there that, that's an important thing. That would also allow for succession planning. So we do have some functionality which says, okay, maybe I want to be in this part of the house now, but in 10 or 15 years, I maybe don't want to be there. And how do I then allow this to be part of succession planning to, pass on to the next generation or whatever might be the case. So that certainly gives you a lot of flexibility. Granny flat is generally fairly cheap to build as well. So even the fact you have a block of land, we have found the return on investment on a granny flat is actually extremely high because you've already got the block of land, right? So if you spend $150,000 or $200,000 on that granny flat, and each one of those rooms is rented out at $200 or $250 or whatever, then just the pure economics of it make a lot of sense. We do see that one thing that is being forgotten is the group dynamics conversation, which is just not being had at all. Car accommodation, we said, can become an issue. And we know there are some important functionalities, particularly with the elders in our community who are transitioning into some of these housing types, is to be aware that you need to have some legal constraints. So if it turns out you have helped your family by moving into a granny flat out in the backyard and you're happy to do that because you don't need the big one to look after, and some of your other family is transitioning into the rest of the property, if you've used that as a succession planning tool, something to be really very careful of is you want to make sure that you have maintained your right to occupy that granny flat regardless of anyone else's need. So we do know that elder abuse in our society is extremely high, and we need to be conscious of the fact that you need to be protected, and that's a little bit of our role.
Having awareness means you can position yourself so that there's agreements articulated up front, clearly spelled out, that it de-risks the whole issue. The challenge always is when those conversations are had in times of stress, distress and emergency. Mum's busted a hip and we're going to put her into this old care home. it's a very different set of circumstances to, no, we've considered this, we've designed for this, we've built it with this intention in mind.
100%. And the only other last thing from a cons point of view to be aware of is you are building in established areas. So it is likely that they might have constraints which a modern development is probably tried to encompass with your land purchase. But it might be in a flood zone. We know that a lot of our close-in suburbs are going to be affected by that, and we've seen that. It might be even that you're in a bushfire area. It might be that you have some other restraint of construction. So that is sometimes a challenge when building granny flats in established areas.
And Darren, in some of your experience, you would have seen lots of homes built that, when it was a cane field that the first family assembled themselves back in the 1930s, there was no building code, there's no bushfire overlay, the floodplain wasn't considered. Now in the 2020s, we've got all of this mapping and understanding of what that means. So it can be quite a different building constraint to even the original intention. The house was there back in this era on some hardwood stumps, and it's been through 3 cyclones, it's fine. But your next evolution has to consider today's standards of construction and council overlay.
Oh, 100%. I mean, things like, people don't realize that, as cities start to form, and certainly they find this in Indonesia and those sorts of places, the cities are collecting vast amounts of water and using concrete mechanisms of roads and that sort of stuff to focus that water. And that just creates flooding issues that sometimes can't be actually modeled or understood, so it's not like someone's done something and this has ended up as a bad situation. Sometimes it just happens because this street now has water in it that didn't have street in it before, which means the water can't get away with the speed it might have once upon a time. And then that's why if you just built straight on the ground there in a yard that always goes underwater, well, then your new granny flat is going to be swamped by that. But it's just about being aware, and that's some of the things that's part of our role, is actually to help people when they get to the building phase to be aware of those things. So moving on from the situation of talking solely about granny flats, but also considering how that looks renovating or as a component of a renovation. So renovation and improving there. I'll get into trouble here because I'll use the word missing middle, and if Malcolm Holtz ever comes back and reads this, he'll get cranky. But ultimately, what we've found is, and this is starting to occur generally, is that at different speeds around Australia, people want to get back into those locations which are closer to the infrastructure. And that generally means that this redevelopment inside of cities has occurred, and that generally occurs in stuff that is generally loosely understood by most people as being the housing stock called the missing middle. So ultimately you have high rise on one end and we have these domestic houses on the other end, and then this mixture of stuff that occurs. That can be duplexing, that can be all of these, small units, that can be all of these configurations. And basically they're just, a reach for people to be trying to find a way to, one, the cities are trying to use their infrastructure better. So how do I use that infrastructure better rather than keep
existing public transport, existing roads, existing schools?
Exactly. And all the road infrastructure and all this stuff that has to be going the further and further you stretch. But also then people are going, I want to live closer to those areas. And the reality that looking after this lawn and gardens and, quarter acre allotment starts to wear a bit thin unless you've necessarily got a green thumb. So this sort of means that, considering renovation as a part of increasing densification, including the granny flat, is something that we think is actually a very good option. Particularly if you speak to us. No, particularly if you have some thought about how to do it. That's all we're asking for you to do is, this is a great solution, but start with you and start with your purpose, and then go, okay, well, could I renovate my existing property, increase its value by maybe potentially adding a granny flat, and then design it with the end in mind, which is so few times that is occurring. But could you design it so that if it's a 2-story at the front, but the upper story has some level of separation from the lower story, so you have some privacy and some amenity.
Yep.
Maybe the granny flat doesn't conflict that. Maybe there's a central spot in the center of the yard which enables the things that we know people are drawn to. So, a place to go and do some gardening and reconnect with nature, a place where we can come and talk and have the talking fire and the talking stick and watch the footy in front of on the back deck or whatever, the space of collaboration, the space of community, that there is that place. And that actually reminds me that quite often I find it interesting when we ever work with clients who are on rural properties, that although they have a front door, everyone shows up at their back patio, right? It's just a human draw to come to the sense of community, which is the back patio where everyone's sitting on the deck. It's a relaxed atmosphere, and you can work together to do that. So if you do it with that in mind, then ultimately there is an opportunity to use granny flats and renovations as a really powerful tool to help have a better property solution. So its pros are it basically allows for better use of existing sites. A lot of the older designs are more capable of being modified for individual occupancy. So what I'm meaning there is quite often a lot of older designs actually had a lot of verandas around them, which means they were naturally thinking about exiting the rooms without having to go through the center. So some of that is purely because of an accident, which is they were designing basically for a non-conditioned space. So not to get too technical, but ultimately they're allowing for the natural breeze and crossflow to enter the house from all areas. Yeah. So that meant that you probably wanted to be able to access those areas at different times of day, which means you necessarily wanted to exit the building via your own bedroom or your own pod. So ultimately, they are sometimes actually really well designed to embrace this idea of honoring your individual needs, but providing a place for you to have communitas. And we believe that is really the core of reinvigorating our cities and regional areas, is to find a way that we can increase density, but still be sympathetic to the idea that you have needs as a human, as an individual, but we also have real benefits that come from connecting within our communities. So I think this is a vehicle that can certainly help to do that.
It's interesting that at some level we seem to be losing the volunteerism and the community work at a large scale.
Yes.
Yet we are, we've never been more digitally connected, yet more lonely. So we're looking for that opportunity to sit around a campfire or to tell stories, and we'll forgive all sorts of stretching the truth about the size of the fish or the whatever, just for the sake of having that community, that communal experience. Sharing a meal, sharing a story, is really quite a core human element.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, because it does humanize why these solutions can really work, have that ability. I also think that when we think about it, the government has been talking about aging in place, and they come up with these horrible terms, one, aging, no one wants to get any older, so let's not call it aging in place. But if we're saying that keeping elders within our community is an important step forward, then they're already living in these locations. So quite often just adapting that property to suit more like them, more like-minded people wanting to have like-minded conversations will absolutely enrich our society and community by doing it. And one of the things we're going to have some conversations in the next couple of weeks with is, some councils instantaneously see some challenges with some of the stuff that we're proposing, because they've seen some of the worst case scenario, which is 5 renters or 7 renters trying to pile in there. And that's why people instantaneously go, not in my backyard. I don't want social housing. I don't want affordable housing. Whereas we're not actually doing that. We're actually rebuilding the sense of community within community. So those people who move in there want to be proactive members of a community. They want to enrich them. They want to be the people who can help out when, you've got to go to work and your kids need someone to stay. When the boys need a place to learn how to fix the mower, is there someone in the street who's got, 3 or 4 old blokes who just love to tinker with motors? Is there, when you go to build your, like at the moment, I can't get zucchinis to work in my garden at the moment because there's enough bees to pollinate them. This is the brand new world, but I'm sure there's someone somewhere in my local neighborhood's going, well, this is what you need to plant this beside it because it brings in the bees and then you have enough continued pollination to ensure that occurs. So,
and some of that's that passing on wisdom of elders. So the master craftsman, your father, as an example, a craftsman carpenter, but where does he have the opportunity to sit with the younger apprentice, carpentry apprentice, to share that wisdom and knowledge? And we're losing that in so many facets of our community. In actual fact, elders report at 70+% don't want to leave the geography and location. They know the neighbour, they know the postman, they have all these familiar, comfortable social interactions. That being dislocated to a Hervey Bay seaside retirement village, as the sea change or the tree change or the eldership response really doesn't, it suits very few people and is not healthy.
No, and I think that's the most important part there is it's actually not healthy. So it's, we now know the impact of mental stress on our overall well-being, yet we continue to pressurize and stress the whole of our society by not finding solutions to housing that are considerate of our need for connection and our need for community. And that's really causing some big flow-on effects. So we think this is actually one of the better solutions. If you can't design it from scratch, then certainly being able to modify something that's more likely to suit the occupants and allow for soft densification inside the means of a standard construction system. No council is going to have any issues with any of this. And certainly if you did it well and you showed an example of contributing to community in a great outcome, I'm sure there would be then lots of councils lining up to say, how do we help you do more of that? So I think that's an important outcome. So that's probably covered another 3 or 4 different places, and I just really wanted to touch on them. I probably got 5 or 10 minutes to finish, but what People Purpose Places' role is in this. So ultimately, we have developed a toolkit, and we actually started. I don't know whether you might be able to just close that site down now, CJ. But the toolkit itself, we've developed. We actually started working on the place bit first because it's the bit we know, right? So we were going, hey, look, what tools would you need to design with this in mind and design with the people in mind? And it was at that point we realized, look, until we get these other 2 components sorted, the idea of finding alternative housing solutions completely falls apart if you're not conscious of, one, the individual needs, and then secondly, those individual needs pass on to connected community needs. So we have in the background, when people get to this place part of looking at, I know what I want, and I've found my why, and I'm with a like-minded group of people, and I'm moving on to this place. We have some tools which help people navigate through this design bit. So these solutions are ones that we've been involved in, so we can show that they work and how they work. We've also thousands of other examples of solutions that work. So these are only a snippet. They some solutions, not all of the solutions, or not home run solutions.
And it's not necessary to pick up all of them, Darren, is it? It's you only pick up the tools as necessary to progress you to the next stage of your journey.
100%. So the sections within our toolbox that specifically talk to the place side of things is we start off with design. So this idea that, start with you in mind rather than necessarily, starting with what everyone else has got. Like, let's actually find out what you're trying to do here, and not just today, but what might be the contingency. So if we are going to live in here to eldership, how would a carer come in here? Like, ask the questions that no one wants to ask, because be conscious of that. Or I could really live with you, but I would not like to have to run into you every day, or whatever the case situation is. So thinking about design is part
and it's also the design. I don't see any reason that with just some basic thinking, you could map this for your whole life. So you could actually look at yourself from your child, teenager, adult, parenting, older, kids left home, grandparenting, all of these chapters and stages and evolution of us. And you go, really, most of that can be done within a very similar set of parameters. And maybe to adjust for that, I would need to do these small tweaks. None of it is earth-shattering. None of it is impossible at all. But if you never consider it, you might just paint yourself into a corner.
And I think that's a little bit of our role, right? Is to ask those questions to get you to ponder. If you were here now or tomorrow, how would that look differently? If you're here by yourself or you're here with whatever, how does that change that? If people talk about accessibility, you only think about it when you when you get older, or if you have an injury. But think about it now. If you rolled your ankle and you still needed to access this home, wouldn't it just be better if it was well designed to suit that? And then we look at this building a brief side of things. So some of the stuff we talked about earlier was also around, what are the constraints? What are the stuff you can do? What are the stuff you can't do? Have we considered material types? Have we considered best practice? How do you do all of these things? Then we move forward into the feasibility and costing side of things, because obviously the reality of this has got to operate in the real world. And we're only having this situation, conversation this morning, with how do groups of people finance these things? Is there the capacity for them to support loans? But all of that comes back to how can you afford it and how can you make that functionality work? And then we're looking at this idea that we're trying to approach this process completely different. If the whole idea of humanizing the internal approach, why don't we consider humanizing our commercial relationships? So how can we make sure, if the builder's out there just trying to do enough work to support his family, then that's a worthy and awesome. And if I'm trying to just have a house that suits my needs and is affordable and I can do it, then he would obviously want to, and he's built to a standard that is acceptable. I'm sure that the builder would also be going, yeah, that sounds like a great opportunity. Like that's the people I want to work for or work with who know what they're aiming to do. So we're looking at this as a very collaborative approach. And if we can do that, that means in any location around Australia, we can be looking at these housing solutions really quickly, because we're just mobilizing the existing workforce, the ones who get it and
coach from within the community. So we don't need to transpose technology or people in. It is just to nurture the existing community to deliver it.
Absolutely, 100%. And then looking at building and delivering it. And then some of the most important things is commissioning it and then celebrating it and passing it forward. So, that's one of the things I'm super keen on Ginro to get to, is this idea of being able to celebrate that moment and then use the ongoing learnings of that experience to help others. And I think that's one thing that, there are actually, you hear of them pop up, quite wonderful housing solutions around Australia, but if they are in isolation, they are not community connected, and they don't embrace the people within them, then ultimately some of them really just fall beside the road, never ever take it.
I see some of those gorgeous design shows, for example, where they build beautiful things, but they're in isolation, and none of that learning is shared with the community. And people who do something similar, generation in the future, have to relearn all that hard work. importing a timber and charring it with the Japanese, methodology. Well, the last bloke did that, 30 years ago. Why are you doing, following that same process? Because no one shared that knowledge and shared that experience.
Yeah.
So it would be great to share that at a community level.
Yeah, and then also reconnect and complete the loop, learn what we learn, and then apply that back to other jobs and say, well, there's now more of these solutions which were trialed and they work, or this is what didn't work, and be okay with the ones that fail, because ultimately, the whole it took 10,000 light bulbs to create one that worked is a true story, and we got to be conscious of the fact that nothing's going to be perfect. But if we approach it with that poetic attunement, we can say, this has been good for what it provides, and what did we learn? And that's okay that we learned that, because it's got us one step closer to something that everyone else can get benefit from. So, that's really how we can help in that process, is specifically to have toolbox skills that help you navigate that.
And coach, every community group, individual group that forms to an intentional home that works for their circumstance.
Yeah.
That to me is our greatest work to be done.
Absolutely. And exciting stuff. It'd be great to see groups forming and solutions arriving, and also working through the challenges and getting those highs and lows, and the building connection within the communities is something that is great to look forward to.
Very cool. Appreciate the opportunity to chat again, Darren, on a Monday lunchtime.
Yep, absolutely. And I think we've covered all we needed to. So, circling back to our design and our intent and desired outcomes, I think we've been able to keep our mind on the people when we've been talking about these housing options, but also hopefully we've given some examples so that anyone who does listen to this podcast, or maybe goes back and listens to the snippets that will be uploaded to our website, also can show you, look, I'm more resourced to be able to go, these are some options that I should consider when I'm going on my journey. So I love having a chat to you again today, and probably as good a spot as anyone to pull up stumps.
Sounds good to me. Likewise, appreciate the conversation with our focus that has taken some decades to get to, understanding the human relations. It's the most rewarding work, and absolutely the big benefit for people to come on the journey.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Namaste. Have a great day.
I'll have Christine back next week so we can continue.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Mate,
catch you then.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.